They said she appeared out of nowhere, a girl with no birth record, no family name, and no past that anyone could swear was real. People in the streets whispered that she had the eyes of someone who carried a secret too heavy for her age. When she looked at you, it felt as if she was searching for something inside your face, something she hoped would finally tell her where she belonged. Many turned away from her because of that gaze. Many feared it. Some feared what it meant. One winter night, a storm tore across the small town where she lived. The wind shook the walls, and the shutters slammed like drums of war. In the middle of that storm, the girl pushed open the door of the house where she had been kept since childhood. She stepped outside barefoot, her hair soaked with rain, and yelled a single question into the darkness. It was a question she had carried all her life. No answer came back. Only the sound of the storm swallowing her voice. From that night onward, people began to speak of her differently. They said she did not just want to know who she was, she needed to know. She chased that answer with a hunger that frightened even the women who raised her. When travelers visited the town, she would approach them. She would study their clothes, their accents, their gestures, searching for something that could connect her to a world she had never touched. Rumors grew around her like vines. Some believed she was the lost daughter of a fallen king. Others said she was a fraud who learned to imitate the behavior of nobility. But no one, not even she herself, knew the truth. And the truth was the one thing she could not stop running toward. This is the beginning of the woman the world would come to call Tarakanova, a woman whose search for identity would lead her into the hands of an empire that refused to let her live or die with the truth. If you want to follow this journey to its darkest end, remember to subscribe to the channel. The years that followed shaped her into a woman who carried both grace and uncertainty in every step. She learned how to move through life without answers, and yet she moved with a calm that made others look twice. In the towns she visited, people often stared at her in silence. They could not explain why she appeared familiar. Some thought she resembled portraits they had seen in old books. Others whispered that something about her felt royal. Although she never claimed any title for herself, she simply walked with the quiet posture of someone who refused to shrink, even when she felt lost. When she finally left the small place where she had grown up, she entered a world filled with noise, light, and new voices. Europe's cities were alive with conversations about rulers and empires. Soldiers spoke about battles. Diplomats whispered about alliances that could shift overnight. And people in elegant salons discussed one story more than any other. They spoke about the strange rise and sudden fall of Peter III, the Russian emperor whose own wife Catherine had overthrown him with careful strategy and unshaken resolve. The tale carried a dark shadow that followed the Romanov name for many years. In Venice, she heard something that changed her understanding of herself. She sat in a crowded room where candles burned low and the smell of wine filled the air. A group of guests spoke about secrets from the Russian court. One man said with certainty that Peter III might have fathered a child before his fall, a child hidden far away so that no one could use her as a weapon in the struggle for the throne. The man explained that if the child survived, she would be a living threat to Catherine, the empress who had built her reign on the ruins of her husband. Those words did not fall like simple gossip. They landed in the young woman's mind with the weight of something familiar. She did not breathe for a moment. It felt as if the story had walked toward her from a distance. She listened as the room filled with speculation. Some believed the child had died. Others swore she had been hidden in Europe. One woman even said she had once seen a girl who carried the same sharp eyes and the same posture as Peter III. The young woman stayed silent, but her heartbeat echoed like footsteps inside her chest. From that night forward, she began to gather every small piece of information she could find about Peter III. She learned about his short and troubled reign. She learned how he was removed from power. She learned about the fear that spread through the Russian court after his fall. And slowly, she noticed something that she could not ignore. The timing of his hidden child matched the time of her own birth. The places mentioned in the stories matched the early places of her life. Even the description of the child's appearance carried details that others had spoken about her for years. These discoveries did not make her arrogant. They made her still. They made her quiet. They made her feel as if she might be standing at the edge of something she had always sensed but never understood. She did not claim the story as truth. She only allowed herself to imagine that it could be possible. And in that possibility, she found a sense of direction that she had never felt before. As she walked through the busy streets of Italy, she realized she no longer wandered without purpose. She was following a line that stretched from her present to a past she had never known. A line that might lead her to a throne she did not seek, but a truth she desperately needed. Her search for answers carried her from city to city until she reached the warm shores of Italy. Life there moved at a slower rhythm. Markets filled the streets with color. Voices echoed across canals. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe she could live quietly while gathering the last pieces of the story that had begun to shape her future. But she did not know that her presence had already drawn attention from far away. In St. Petersburg, people close to the Russian court whispered that a young woman in Europe claimed to have ties to Peter III. Some scoffed, others worried, and a few believed that she could become a threat if her story reached the wrong ears. Among those who heard of her was Alexei Orlov. He was known for his sharp instincts and the strange calm he carried during moments that frightened other men. He had served Catherine with loyalty for many years. His reputation was built on victories at sea, swift decisions, and a kind of confidence that made people step back when he entered a room. When he learned about the young woman in Italy, he saw an unfinished task, not a danger, and not a mystery, but a loose thread that needed to be tied before it unraveled into something larger. Orlov traveled to Italy with a small group of trusted men. He dressed simply and kept his intentions hidden. The first time he saw her, she was standing near a balcony overlooking the water. Her posture was calm, her expression steady. She looked like someone who carried a burden but refused to be crushed by it. Orlov studied her for a long moment. He had seen people pretend to be nobles before. He had seen real nobles fall into ruin. But this woman did not fit either category. She carried herself with gentle pride, and that made his task both easier and harder at the same time. When he approached her, he spoke with warmth. He told her he had heard of her story. He told her he wished to help her find clarity. She listened closely, watching every small movement in his face. He seemed sincere. His voice had no tremor. His words carried a tone that invited trust. For a woman who had lived most of her life without certainty, that tone felt like a safe place to rest for a moment. She did not think he came from the Russian court. She believed he might be someone who understood her confusion without judgment. Over the next few days, they met often. They walked through quiet alleys. They shared meals in crowded rooms where no one paid them any attention. Orlov asked gentle questions about her life. She answered them without fear. She spoke about her travels, her doubts, and the strange pull she felt toward a past she had never seen. He listened with an intensity that made her feel visible. She mistook that intensity for care. He allowed her to believe it because it served his purpose. He never pushed her to make decisions quickly. Instead, he allowed her to feel understood. And little by little, she began to think that her search might finally be bringing her somewhere. She believed she had found the first person who wanted to help her uncover the truth instead of shaping it into something convenient. She began to relax in his presence. She let her guard down. It was a simple human instinct, born from loneliness and exhaustion. One late afternoon, the sun cast long reflections across the sea. Orlov invited her to board a ship that was anchored nearby. He told her the ship would carry her to people who could give her the records she needed. He spoke with the same calm tone he had used since the day they met. She looked at the ship. She looked at him. And she believed him. She walked toward the ramp with steady steps. The wind lifted her hair. The water below rocked gently. She felt no fear because she did not yet understand that her journey was crossing a line it could never return from. The moment her foot touched the wooden deck, the air around her changed. It was not something she could explain. It was a small shift, almost silent, but enough to make her pause for a breath. The sailors moved with stiff precision. No one greeted her. No one smiled. Their eyes slid over her quickly, then looked away as if she were a burden they had been ordered to carry. She tried to ignore the discomfort. She told herself it was simply the discipline of men who lived at sea. She followed Orlov across the deck until they reached a quiet corner near the side of the ship. He spoke gently and told her to rest. He said the ship would not sail until the tide changed. He pointed her toward a cabin prepared for her and encouraged her to settle inside. His voice remained soft, steady, and kind. She held on to that tone because it was familiar. It was the same tone that had guided her steps from Venice to this moment. She walked toward the cabin without hesitation. Inside, the room was small but tidy. A chair, a narrow bed, a single lantern hanging from a hook. Everything felt controlled and plain. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. She expected Orlov to return soon to explain the next steps of her journey. The floor beneath her feet shifted as the ship slowly awakened with the current. She felt a mixture of excitement and relief. She believed she was finally moving toward the truth that had eluded her for so long. Time passed quietly. Then the sound of heavy steps filled the hallway. The door opened, but it was not Orlov who entered. Two sailors stepped inside. Their faces carried no warmth. They did not bow or greet her. They simply informed her that the cabin door would remain locked for her safety. The sentence felt strange. Safety did not require a lock. Her breath tightened. She asked where Orlov was. The sailors only repeated the same line before pulling the door shut. The lock clicked with a dull finality that echoed through her chest. She stood up quickly and tried the handle. It did not move. She pressed her palm against the wood as if she could feel answers on the other side. She called for Orlov with a voice that tried to stay steady, but the walls swallowed her words. No reply came. Only the deep creak of the ship drifting into open water. She realized then that the tide had changed. The ship was moving. She could feel the shift in its rhythm. She could feel the pull of distance growing between herself and the city she had left behind. She sank slowly into the chair, her hands trembling. She was not foolish. She understood what a locked door meant. She began to replay every word Orlov had spoken to her, every smile, every question, every moment that had felt sincere. She tried to find even one sign that he had lied, but there had been none. His calm had been perfect. His kindness had been convincing. And she had trusted him because she had wanted to believe that someone finally stood beside her. Hours passed. When the door opened again, Orlov stepped inside. He did not carry the gentle expression she had known. His posture was rigid. His eyes were cold. There was no warmth left to hold on to. She asked where they were going. He answered simply that the Empress had been patient long enough, that the ship was returning to Russia, that her story would be decided by those who had the power to end it. The words fell like stones. She felt the world tilt beneath her. The cabin seemed smaller. The air felt thinner. She stared at him as if trying to recognize the man she had trusted, but he was no longer there, or perhaps he had never been there at all. He turned without another word and left her inside the locked room. Outside, the sea swallowed the last traces of daylight. The ship carried her toward a country she had never seen, but one that already held the power to decide her fate. The fortress known as Peter and Paul did not welcome her with noise or threats. It greeted her with something far worse. Silence. Thick and cold like the stone walls that surrounded her. She was led through narrow corridors where the air never moved and the lanterns cast tired shadows. No one explained why she had been brought here. No one asked her anything. The guards walked beside her without a single glance. She felt like a shape they had been ordered to deliver. Nothing more. When the door to her cell opened, she stepped inside as if crossing into another world. The room was small and built from blocks of stone that held the winter inside them. The cold rose from the walls and sank into her bones. She touched the stones with the back of her hand. The chill stung her skin. She pulled away, but the cold followed her through the room like a quiet presence that watched her every move. The door closed behind her. The lock clicked. The sound echoed, then faded into a silence that felt almost alive. She waited for someone to explain what would happen to her. No one came. She waited for a voice, a reason, a charge, even a lie. Nothing. The silence pressed against her until the air inside the cell felt thinner with each passing breath. Days turned into shapes she could not count. There were no clocks, no voices, only a small window set high in the wall. Sometimes the sky above it was gray, sometimes it was white. She learned to tell the hours only by the small shift of that distant light. It became the only reminder that the world outside still existed, but the world no longer seemed to include her. Food arrived twice a day, always quietly, a bowl placed on the floor, the door shut again. She tried to ask questions. She asked what her crime was. She asked whether she was to be tried. She asked if her claim to be the daughter of Peter III would be examined or dismissed. She asked if anyone in the court knew she was here. Every answer she hoped for vanished into the silence before it even reached the air. The uncertainty ate at her slowly. She had known fear before, but never like this. In Venice, in Paris, in every crowded room across Europe, she had always felt alive, even when doubts followed her. But the silence of the fortress did not leave space for life. It pressed on her mind until her thoughts felt heavy. She began to doubt her memories. She began to doubt her own face in the small puddle of water that gathered near the wall each morning. The stone room seemed to swallow her identity piece by piece. She walked in circles around the cell to keep her body awake. She sat in the corner to steady her breathing. Sometimes she whispered her name softly just to hear something human in the room. She repeated the name she believed was hers. She repeated the name she dreamed might belong to her true father, but even her own voice sounded thin, like it did not belong to her anymore. What gnawed at her most was not fear of harm. It was fear of vanishing, fear of being erased, fear that she would die here and no one would ever know whether she had spoken the truth or not. The thought tightened inside her chest each night. She did not fear chains. She did not fear punishment. She feared the silence that denied her the answer she had chased her whole life. The fortress was more than a prison. It was a question with no reply. And she understood slowly, painfully, that the cold stones around her were meant to break not her body, but her certainty. She was trapped in a place where even time refused to speak, a place where she might spend the rest of her days without ever learning who she truly was. The storm reached the city without warning. A wall of wind swept across the river and slammed into St. Petersburg, bending trees and sending people rushing into their homes with frightened eyes. The market stalls fell one after another. Horses reared. Lanterns went dark. The Neva River rose with a force that made the fishermen run from the docks. They knew the water was no longer calm. It was angry. Within minutes, the river swallowed the lower streets and rushed toward the old stone walls of the fortress. Inside the fortress, she felt the first sign of disaster as a vibration beneath her feet. It came softly at first, almost like a sigh from the stones themselves. She stood still, listening. Then another vibration followed, stronger, sending a faint ripple across the surface of her water cup. A thin crack along the wall began to glisten. She stepped closer. A drop of icy water fell onto her hand. The moment it touched her skin, a shiver rose through her entire body. More water pushed through. First a slow line, then a steady sheet. The storm outside was forcing the river into the lower levels of the fortress. She backed away and climbed onto the bed. The water spread across the floor, coating the stones with a thin, shimmering layer. The cold rose with it, sharp and unforgiving. She kept her knees pulled close to her chest. Her breath grew shallow. She watched the water move like a living thing, reaching for the corners of the room with silent determination. The storm slammed against the fortress. Each strike made the lantern flicker. The sound outside grew deeper, like the river itself was roaring against the walls. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm the trembling that ran through her. She called out once, hoping a guard might pass by, but the wind stole her voice before it reached the door. There were no footsteps, no distant keys, no human sound at all, only the storm. The water climbed higher. It reached the legs of the bed and wrapped them in cold. She lifted her feet as the mattress tilted slightly. The icy touch stung her skin and left her limbs stiff. She held on to the bed frame, her fingers turning pale. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. She tried to stay calm. She tried to steady her breathing, but the water kept rising. She looked at the tiny window above, the sliver of sky turning darker with each passing moment. She wondered if anyone outside knew she was here. She wondered if the city was fighting its own battles against the storm. But she knew no one was coming. The fortress had been built to hide its prisoners, and tonight it hid her so well that the world had already forgotten she existed. The water reached her waist. She gasped as the cold tightened around her ribs. Her breath shook. Her arms trembled. She clung to the floating mattress as the bed lifted from the floor. The cell became a dark pool. The storm roared like a giant outside the walls. The river pushed harder, pouring in through every opening. She whispered to herself to stay awake, to hold on. but the cold numbed her body. Her fingers slipped. Her strength thinned. She knew she had only moments left, and in those moments, she spoke the name she had carried across countries. The name she believed might be her father's. She whispered it once, then again, softer than before. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered. It was the last piece of herself she still held. The water lifted her one final time. The storm outside kept raging, and the river inside the cell rose until it erased everything. When the river finally calmed, St. Petersburg stepped out of its fear with slow and uncertain movements. People opened their doors and looked at the gray morning sky with tired relief. They swept the broken pieces of their lives from the streets and spoke in hushed voices about the night when the wind had torn across the rooftops. The city had survived, but something in the air felt different, as if the storm had taken more than it returned. No one mentioned the fortress at first. It stood far enough from their homes to remain a distant shadow. The guards were the first to walk its flooded halls. Their boots sent ripples across the cold water. Lanterns flickered as they searched the lower levels. The walls were soaked. Wood floated in broken shapes. Doors hung crooked from their frames. The storm had pushed the river into the deepest parts of the prison with a force the old stone had not been able to resist. The guards moved without speaking. They carried the heavy silence of men who expected to find loss. When they opened her cell, the water inside shifted in a slow wave. At first they saw nothing but floating debris. Then a pale shape brushed gently against the bed frame. A sleeve lifted. A lock of dark hair followed the movement of the current. One guard stepped forward and pulled her from the water. Her eyes were closed. Her face rested in a stillness that felt almost peaceful. She carried no mark of struggle. Her fingers were curved delicately, as if she had tried to hold something that was no longer there. The guards lowered their heads. They did not know her history or her claim. They only knew the storm had taken her without mercy. They carried her body through the empty corridors. Water dripped from her clothes and echoed softly in the silence. Outside, the morning light spread across the river in a silver glow that softened the brutal edges of the night. They buried her in the frozen ground near the fortress wall. The earth was hard and unwelcoming. The grave was shallow and unmarked. There were no prayers, no voices speaking her name. Within minutes, the snow covered the earth until nothing remained to show she had ever been there. But stories rarely die in silence. A few days later, a merchant whispered that the woman who drowned in the fortress had once spoken of a royal father. The rumor moved from the docks to the markets. It reached the ears of an artist who had a fascination with the tragedies of the Romanov line. He imagined her standing in a cold cell. He imagined the water rising. He imagined her calling a name she believed connected her to a throne she had never touched. With these images in mind, he painted her as a forgotten princess whose death carried the sadness of an empire turned against its own blood. Others saw the painting and felt a strange sympathy for the woman they had never met. They repeated the tale, adding their own details. Some said she had been betrayed. Others said she had been hidden from birth. A few claimed she had been the true daughter of Peter III. No one knew the truth, and the truth no longer mattered. What survived was the feeling. The image of a young woman swallowed by a storm because she dared to chase the answer to her own name. Year after year, the story traveled farther than she ever could. Across cities, across borders, across time. She became a symbol of the quiet tragedies hidden behind royal walls. A reminder that some lives are erased not by failure, but by the fear of those who hold power. If you want to uncover more forgotten stories like hers and walk deeper into the shadows that history tried to bury, remember to stay with this channel. Like this video, share it, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale the world tried to silence.